Hey there. So I want to point this out, and it is simply that anytime we are blaming someone else for our discomfort, our suffering, our triggers, how an uncomfortable way we feel, the way we're behaving, anytime we're blaming someone else, we are not healing. And the reason why I know this is true is because anytime we're pointing our finger outside, our attention is not where it needs to be in order to heal. So if we were to withdraw those projections and blame and just went inward into our own self to find the root cause of why we feel that way. So first we acknowledge that we feel that way. And if we're blaming someone else, you might think, well, I wouldn't be blaming them if I didn't know I was feeling that way. I feel that way that I blame them, so I've already acknowledged it. Okay, maybe. But what if you just acknowledged it by looking at it directly instead of trying to make it go over there? Instead of trying to make it their fault, what if you just said, I acknowledge that I have this feeling? And once you acknowledge you have the feeling, then you want to understand yourself on why you have this feeling, validate that it is valid, it is understandable that you have the feeling. So as long as we are pinning it on someone else, we cannot heal. So I encountered somebody recently in my life who is separating from someone, their partner, because they keep getting triggered, and they said they need some alone time in order to heal. And this person is actually triggered within their relationship because they are often alone. And it's kind of interesting that even though they're often alone within the relationship because the partner is working or whatever, they are triggered by being alone, and they want to be alone so they can heal. But the interesting thing is, by being separate from this person, by breaking it off, even though they were already alone within the relationship, the reason that they have a better chance of healing is because they no longer have that person there to blame. Now, all of a sudden, that person's not the one activating their triggers around abandonment or whatever it is that comes up when they're alone. And now they have to take responsibility for it. So, if you are in a relationship and you are blaming the other person for all the issues that you feel, you won't heal simply because you're blaming them instead of looking within. Not everyone will have to separate from the relationship in order to do that, but some people will have to because they may not realize that that's what's holding them up from healing, the blame. All right, one moment, I'll be right back. I'm going to pause on this topic, do a little chore that I know needs to be done, and I'll be back. Okay, here's some more thoughts on this topic. A little while back, I came across a post by this teacher of divine masculine energy, who posts on Instagram. And I actually really liked most of what he was sharing. And usually what he was sharing was from a higher perspective of this evolution that we're going through and kind of where we want to shift to in order to use our energy effectively with each other and things like that. And so his perspectives were helpful in that way. And I thought this is a good resource. But this one particular day, he's just a human. Excuse me. This one particular day, he posted about how he had sympathy for women who had been victimized and how, 'cause, he was sick of spiritual teachers telling them that it was their fault, that they lined up with it. And that it wasn't their fault, and it, it was the fault of the perpetrator. And, excuse me, though what he's saying, the words make sense to me and everything, the vibration felt like, ooh, to me, like I was just like, ooh. And that, ooh, alerted me to there was something lower vibrational in what he was doing and saying. And it was that he was using sympathy, like, poor you, poor you. Poor you is a lower vibration, right? Because, like, we are all souls, beings, humans having human experiences. We did come into this life to have these experiences, but I understand that he was coming from a very human perspective of what it is to be victimized, which is a valid experience that many of us have had. And perhaps he was aiming to validate it, which makes sense because we know that's an important step along the way, to acknowledge and validate our experiences when we have been overwhelmed or unable to process the emotion of them, or if they're looping in our experience. Those are two important steps in order to alleviate that loop. So I went to the comments section, and I wasn't alone in feeling that what he was saying was a bit low vibe or a bit disempowering. It felt disempowering. Because of many people, and by what they were saying, I could tell that they like me, had healed from those perspectives and those experiences of being victimized. Because what they were saying was, listen, like, I had to take responsibility for my part in that. That's how I healed. And it was again and again in the comments section, women saying, I get what you're saying, but I couldn't just sit there and blame the other person. I couldn't just say it wasn't my responsibility. I couldn't just say, boo-hoo, I'm a victim. Every one of them was taking responsibility for their part in the scenario. So I was like thankful in one way, because I was like, okay, cool, because like people are getting it. People are really healing because they wouldn't have these perspectives. These perspectives show me that they have done what it takes to heal, because on the other side of that, you have compassion for the situation, but not just for yourself as a victim, but for also the victimizer, the perpetrator. Because anyone who is abusive has usually been abused. It's them blaming or projecting their pain onto someone else, them perpetuating the cycle of abuse. That's how they began the abuse. So when you heal, you come back to compassion because you've neutralized all the energies and you've taken everything you could out of the situation as any way it could benefit you. And then once you've neutralized the energy, you see the bigger picture view. And from the bigger picture view, you see your own part in it. Now, say you're like just walking down the street and somebody assaults you, like totally random, right? I can understand it would be very hard to find your place in there or your responsibility in it. But maybe in those kind of situations, and I can only say maybe because I've never been in that type situation, but maybe in those type situations, you're learning something like the power of an open heart instead of being in fear in that moment, having an open heart. Like Byron Katie tells a story about how someone was holding a gun to her face, and her open heart had them dropping the gun, and she lived to tell about it. And maybe also taking responsibility for just caretaking the self through the situation, right? Like it wasn't your fault that happened to you, but it's your responsibility to love and caretake the part of yourself that got scared, that got overwhelmed, that feared for your life, right? But those experiences aren't patterns, aren't loops. So they're not necessarily what we're talking about here, right? A one-time experience where you had an abusive situation, that's that's not the same. That's not the same thing as healing a loop of energy. But that's the type of situation that could start a loop. Because if you can't process through that, then you can lodge that, overwhelm that PTSD in you, and start recreating and attracting situations that remind you of that, and remind you that that feeling is still unprocessed in you every time it's triggered in you. So those situations can serve a purpose on a higher level to just be an example of of an opportunity to learn or practice how to process through difficult, traumatic situations so that they don't affect your whole entire life, right? I've heard people say that trauma stays with you for life, that loss stays with you for life. That I don't feel that's true. That's certainly not my experience. So I won't validate for them. Maybe from their perspectives and how they're living and whatever energies they're working with, that's their perspective. But that's not a universal truth. Because I find myself to be quite whole and quite alleviated and neutralized on situations where I come around to the bigger picture view. But anyhow, taking responsibility for my part in abusive cycles and loops involves, like, where did I not have my self-esteem built up? Where did I not value my own treatment and care enough? Where did I think that I wasn't worth it? Where did I feel so desperate for love that I would turn a blind eye to things? These are all things that allowed me to be in abusive patterns with people who mistreated me. But it's a mistreatment of myself to allow me to be treated that way. So I have to take responsibility for that and heal that. That's within my control. How I allow myself to repeatedly be treated is within my control. And how I treat myself is within my control. So it's not right and okay that people go around abusing others, but once you heal yourself and you're no longer having to blame that person or feel like a victim, because you're no longer trying to avoid the pain of it, because you've actually been present with the pain of it. Once you know you're bigger than that experience, then you can kind of look at that experience and realize, oh, this perpetrator, this person that I was blaming, this victimizer or abuser was also abused. And this is a cycle that they have not been able to break, that they've been perpetuating. And if you've been able to break it, you don't look at a person who hasn't been able to break it with disgust or judgment. You look at them with compassion because you understand how hard that was. You understand that it takes very much it takes a very large amount of bravery to sit with those uncomfortable feelings. So it's understandable when we have even culture that is centered around feeling victimized, you know, when it's appropriate for large groups of people to say, me too, and then just like bond over the fact that they've all been abused or mistreated. It's understandable that, like, people who feel alone or lonely or lost in their victimization would cling to that and feel justified and right because of the large number of people who are also doing it. But I would urge us to know that that's a step on the process, that if you've been victimized and you've been hurt by it and you haven't been able to process that hurt, then yes, feeling victimized is one of the feelings that you'll be present with. And being present with the feelings is one of the steps that it takes in order to heal the situation. So while it is important to honor that step and be present with and allow yourself to feel like a victim in those situations, it is also just as important to know that it doesn't mean anything about you. It's a feeling that you had. It's an experience that you had. It doesn't change your worth, your value. All of that is inherent and with you from the day you were born, the day you were conceived. It's with you from before you came to earth, your value. And so while I don't want to disempower anyone who feels victimized and who feels more comfortable staying in that feeling of being victimized, I do want to be an example of moving past that and not letting our experiences um, be a detriment to our lives, but instead letting our experiences inspire us to something. Because I think that is the reason that we have these experiences. I talked a little bit about maybe, someone was experiencing something that they hadn't solved yet because they were going to come up with a new solution to it, something that hadn't been done yet. And that's valid, right? Like, they wouldn't have been inspired to solve it in that way if they had not experienced it. So, as a soul coming in to have a human experience, they might sign up for that and they might not want to take the solutions that are already available. But on many of these things that are happening on Earth, it's been played out so many times, for thousands of years, that we already know all we need to know about that energy. It's been mastered so many times over that there's nothing new in that experience, you know? But then there are other situations. Well, I don't want to say nothing new. I don't want to say nothing new. I'll take that back. I'll say it like this. Some of the experiences on Earth aren't as inspiring as others, Some of them we've already played out so many times that it's like we are ready to move on to new things. We are ready to have new creations, right? Like we already know about the hell realm. We already know about what it's like to live in limitless loops of disempowerment or pride or greed or wrath or, or lust. We know what all that is as humans. And there's this limitless possibilities that exist. While all those 7 deadly sins, so-called, exist perpetually, so don't the limitless possibilities. And we are allowed to play in those limitless possibilities. And sometimes that can be scary because it's limitless and we don't know about it. Whereas if we're in fear, the known, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's lust, even if it's anger or whatever, can be more comfortable than the limitless possibilities. But the limitless possibilities allow us to create and expand, you know? So sometimes one of those lower density places, like the 7 deadly sins, inspire us to expand. And sometimes we just have to use those experiences as a means to learn about who we really are and what we're really capable of. Like the person that I am today is someone who would be responsible with the power of creation. I understand that it's important to keep the highest good of all in mind when I create. I understand that working selfishly for my own needs could really hurt a lot of people and could backfire on me. And I learned that because of the experiences that I had, because I learned what it was to be treated detrimentally by someone who is only thinking of themselves. I learned that it was possible to actually create a win-win-win. I learned that possibility. And then I knew that if war is invalid, if no one has to lose, like I've been taught earlier on in my life, why wouldn't I focus on the solutions that offer the win-win-win, where no one has to lose out, right? And these are sustainable. These win-win-wins are sustainable. So it's possible that someone is staying in, disempowered states and playing the blame game and feeling like a victim for extended periods of time, and that it's still serving them. And it's possible that they just didn't know how to heal yet. It's possible they didn't have the tool. It's possible they didn't have someone in their view that could inspire them to do the work for themselves, or just let them know that it was possible. I'm so thankful for the people that were in my view that made me understand what was possible. And to be honest, the thing that made me know that something was possible wasn't the people who were around me or in my view that had healed themselves. I actually came to healing myself quite naturally through learning that the law of attraction exists. And I should say, remembering that the law of attraction exists. But before that, I was so steeped in victim, in lack, in trauma, in there's not enough, I'm not enough, I've been abused and victimized. I was so steeped in that, in the pain of that, and the overwhelm of everything that I hadn't yet processed through my whole childhood and early adulthood, that I was collapsing under the pressure of it. I wanted to die every day for years. And no solutions were in my sight. But then the movie The Secret came out. And I've seen a lot of spiritual teachers kind of rail against the law of attraction as a teaching. And I understand their point of view because we have a soul's intention here. And when we get a hold of the law of attraction, we might spend a lot of time trying to manifest and create something that isn't even in alignment with ourselves and our soul's intention because we're doing it from our fear. So, those spiritual teachers are sort of warning people against getting off track because we really do want to be led by our heart ultimately. And if you've come across the law of attraction before you're able to open your heart, you're going to be manifesting from fear programs and from stuff that could detract you from what your contribution in the limitless possibilities that exist is, or is meant to be, or is potential of. But and you may not be taking into consideration the win-win-win. You might be manifesting to the detriment of yourself or others without even knowing it, because you don't even realize that you can make that part of your manifestation, that you're asking for something if it's in the greatest good of all. It's really nice to include that in your manifestations if you're doing that. But for me, the reason why the law of attraction saved my life, remembering it or knowing about it at that time, was because it presented a possibility for a different life. And as far as I was concerned, I just wanted to stop living the life I was living. There was no solution in sight. I was suffering every moment. The anxiety was so active and overwhelming for me that I was constantly like moving in my body, like couldn't be comfortable, couldn't sit still, couldn't leave my house, was in bed most of the time. And every thought that, okay, so I was introduced to the law of attraction, and it was like, I wonder if it's true that your thoughts create your reality. I wonder if it's true. So there was a question that I asked where I had not asked this before, because before I was just in suffering. I was just in the reverberation of the trauma. And I had lived a lot of trauma up to that point, right? Just like a lot of people who are in the blame game, who are saying, oh, you keep triggering me. I have a lot of triggers and you're the reason I keep getting triggered. Can't I just be in this little box where you're not triggering me? I get it, right? I get it. That's why I spent most of my time in bed, because I could not leave my house or interact with anyone without being triggered. So it was very, very overwhelming, and I didn't know anything about anything. Like, I didn't know that I could heal. I didn't know how to heal. All I knew was like I had lived basically in a war zone, no examples of anyone healing themselves or living a happy life or thriving, or it was all struggle and violence. And I was just in such a disempowered state and had a lot of actual physical traumas happen to me with violence and sexual assault, and just powerlessness, and also like infighting within the family, right? Because there was not just me getting triggered, everybody was getting triggered, because we had all grown up in such a tumultuous, violent situation. And that was carried through my family line, right? Because there was a lot of violence perpetrated in my father's line, like physical, actual violence, and some sexual violence as well. And through my mother's line, there was just so many children, that the family was sort of run like a business, where there was no real like one-on-one time with children, because there just couldn't be. So what that means is everybody has a chore to do, and nobody's needs are really like one-on-one addressed. Like there's a family to run, and we got to get stuff done, and there's not enough money to go around, and so you have a role, and so when you bring somebody up like that, like they're a robot, and like what they are and who they are doesn't matter, there are certain things that they do to cope. Some of them are people pleasing and low self-worth, and all kinds of things like that. But anyway, so these two things came together to create the household that I was brought up in. So there was this violence and this disempowerment, and like no self-worth, and so that's what I was brought into, and I was actually programmed for survival and fear. And so it was like hard to come into that, like, and there were no examples in sight of anyone like overcoming stuff like that. I didn't even know that was a thing. So to be introduced to the possibility that my thoughts create my realities caused me to look at my thoughts. And upon looking at my thoughts, I realized, okay, every thought that I have is negative. That was what my life had shown me. That was what I was programmed to. And so once I realized, okay, if my thoughts create my reality and every thought that I have is negative, maybe I could try changing my thoughts. And that's how I started. And I did that because I watched The Secret, because I understood that the law of attraction existed. I started changing one thought at a time. Now, back then, it would just be like, okay, any thought that I had, and they were all traumatic thoughts, just so you know, because that's what was reverberating in my mind. All my traumas, all my disempowering experiences were reverberating. That was what it was. It wasn't like anything else. There was no inspired idea or curiosity leading me, because everything was a reverberation of the unprocessed, overwhelming past that I had lived up to that point, and probably through my ancestry as well. So I start taking any thought that came into my mind, and then like working it through, like, okay, well, how is the opposite true? And I would literally turn it around in my mind and look for ways that the opposite was true. I did this just by my own experiment to see if the law of attraction really worked, if it was true. So it would be like, okay, um, you know, maybe my thought was like a fear about, I don't know, that, we'll say this, my car was gonna, I don't even know if I had a car most of that time, but say my fear, like the thought was, oh, my car's gonna break and I won't have money to fix it, and blah, blah, blah. And then I would like turn that around in my mind and be like, okay, well, is it true that my car is going to break? Well, I have no proof of that. And a lot of cars run all the time. And like, not everyone always has car trouble. And like, because having car trouble was a pattern in my family. And also it being like a detrimental thing because the money was so tight all the time that no one could get the car fixed and blah, blah, blah. And so I would like just wrestle these thoughts and try to prove to myself that it was possible that it wasn't true and turn them around to positive. And so some of them I would turn them around to positive and then they would go. I was like, okay. Some of them would keep coming back, right? And a lot of those ones were about like, you know, guilt things like, oh, I did this and that makes me a terrible person, or, oh, I can't live up to the expectations of my mother and this makes me a terrible person. And then I would try to like wrestle that one and then it would come back and I would wrestle it again and it would come back and wrestle it again and it would come back. So I noticed there were patterns because I noticed that some of the thoughts were the same thoughts and I had to wrestle them repeatedly in order to get them to quell. So I was spending time in bed anyway, in the stillness, and I just started doing this. So, it was a long time that I was doing this for, while I was just in my bed, not living life, except for to reprogram my mind. And I reprogrammed it one thought at a time. And slowly but surely, things started to change in my life. It got easier. It got like where I could get out of bed for a minute, where I could interact with somebody, where I could just start to see other possibilities in life that I could never see before through the lenses of the traumas that I had yet to process. So I started by changing my thoughts, and I did that because I knew that it was possible that that was something that could change my life. And it did. Now, as you know, I've come to this point where I've come up with this formula that I do for myself if I have an energy that's like looping. And that's more than just changing my thoughts, because eventually as I like did that more and more, I understood more and more. Things became a little bit more clearer, right? And so a lot of my life wasn't like, sure, I wanted to manifest things that I liked, right? But like that wasn't working for me, And when I would look into like why that might be, it was like, oh, well, you're also manifesting from your soul's intentions and your subconscious. And I was like, oh yeah, my subconscious is probably still full of stuff that is against me, because that's what my whole life had been up to that point. So I started working on my subconscious, hence shadow work. Subconscious is shadow, is below the level of awareness. So I started making that stuff, bringing that stuff up to light, putting that stuff into my awareness so that I could examine it and reprogram it. And I did this for years and years, and that was what began my process of healing. And as you can see from my story, that I did that by not blaming anyone else. I took it all on myself. I started looking within to myself to see what I was thinking. It was all about me in order to like learn what I was thinking, learn what was in my subconscious, look within to see what it is. What is the issue here? Why is my reality showing this? If my thoughts create my reality, why is my reality showing this? And I was looking within to see what it was. And then eventually it wasn't just thoughts, it was patterns, that like bigger like scenarios that were playing out in my reality. And even just this past week, after like 10, I don't know, about 10 years of doing shadow work consistently, it it's become less and less that I find these like older patterns. But even just this past week, I guess we're at Thursday or Friday, I'm not sure, but like earlier in the week, what day is it? Oh, today's Thursday. So earlier in the week, I had realized a pattern, an old pattern was coming up for me. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, I didn't know that was still in there, you know? And I did the process on it, but it was just time for it to come up, There weren't any experiences happening to me on a regular basis that would remind me of that feeling. But it was one of those old traumas that I had lived out from before I started healing that actually just got healed this week. But it was like finally became the version of myself that could handle that one. That was a big one. That was a doozy. And the reason I'm not mentioning it is just because there are other people involved in it. And in order to tell the story, I kind of do want to tell the story, but I kind of have to hold back on that one for a while longer before I share. But basically, it was, something where I was in fear over an experience that I had. And then looking back on it, it was actually imprinted into me from my mother. Like she had held that energy too. It was imprinted in me. I lived it out. It was suppressed and kind of repressed into me until this day, these days when I'm fully capable and prepared, have the tools and the capacity to process those big, overwhelming emotions of fear back then. Now, upon healing it, I could see, wow, this particular fear that's been lodged in me, in my subconscious all these years, has lived out so many times and caused me so much more trauma and detriment just from having that energy in me. Like that energy played out not consistently every day, but for periods of time in my life. And of course, when we're acting from those fearful places, instead of healing them, we're making decisions based on fear. And those decisions I made based on fear always led me to a more detrimental or painful place because the fear was in the ingredients of the decision that I made. So this, coming to the point where I could actually be present with all that pain, it took a lot. It took, it took this version of me to do that. And it was not an easy thing to do. It was very painful. So I want to say, like, this process of undoing and looking at my subconscious is ongoing for me, but it always is me looking at me. And there were other people involved. Yeah, I say my mother had that energy and passed it on to me, but what it was is an energy of fear because of having to deal with someone outside of us, right? Like she was dealing with someone outside of her, put it in fear. I was always, there was something outside of me that seemed to be the cause of the experience I was having. So if I was willing to blame that thing as the cause, then I wasn't dealing with the energy within me. So I had to become the version of myself that could deal with that energy within me and be brave enough to do so, and then be present with the feeling, and then it could resolve. And now I just come to a place where I have compassion, right, for myself, for the others, and for my mother, and for the whole situation. There's like, I don't know what I want to say about that. I can feel the energy right now, and I'm just realizing, oh, okay, maybe there's still more of that to process, because I can feel a sadness about having experienced that. So, okay, so there's more of that for me to experience. Now, this, like I said, was a very big one. So I've already, like, been present with certain feelings about it, and then it's like I kind of get a break, and now it's like, oh, another layer of that wants to be have my love, which is the sadness over having experienced that. So being present with the sadness, not for the purpose of letting it go, but it will let go at some point. And it's valid to be sad about what has happened. I was living out perpetually an energy that caused detriment to myself and others, and caused me to make decisions that I prefer that I wouldn't have had to make, and made me feel very like powerless and very like scared and sad, you know? So yeah, more sadness. And maybe that's like the whole point of this talk, right? It's like, how else am I going to be reminded of that? Actually, the situation that most recently reminded me of it got to be very intense, and I needed to separate from the situation in order to see what it was trying to show me about me. But I also knew at that time that there was more in it for me, and I was leaving it prematurely. Like, you know what I mean? Like, if I had been able to process in real time, I would have stuck with it a little bit longer and been able to process through it with it while being in it. Just like the example that I gave in the beginning of this talk, where I talked about, did I talk about that? How you can heal within a relationship if you're not blaming. And if you can withdraw your projections and look within. I'm not sure if I actually said that, but um, I was not able to do that in this instance on this thing. So I had to leave the situation. Not because I was actively blaming, but I was just overwhelmed by the feelings and seeing through the lens of the fear. So I couldn't see any solution. So once I was out of it and I was more in a calm, balanced place again, then I revisited it and looked at it and went, oh, I see the pattern now. Okay. First, I acknowledged how I was feeling, validated why I was feeling that way, accepted that it was present in the reality, and then it just clicked in. Oh, I see the pattern. I remember when this happened before. And then it flashed all kinds of times that it happened, and all kinds of times where I made decisions based on feeling those ways. And then even looked back to my mother's situation and saw how that actually played out in her life as well. And that's not the first time that I've played out situations that I saw in retrospect having played out in my mother's life too. It's just that I'm the one who was able to break the cycle of that, right? Like, and I probably came to do that, right? It it there was sure a part of me that needs to feel victimized by that along the process of healing. It's only a part of what I feel about that. The bigger part of me, the whole, more whole part of me knows that this is an experience that I chose, that I created in order for my soul to experience it and perhaps to be inspired to something. And perhaps to just break the so-called curse, right? To break it so that now for my children, I am an example of it being healed, right? And if I'm an example of it being healed, then they know that's a possibility. And through my talk, you know that I've said that, like, I needed to know there was a possibility of something different in order to make changes. So just knowing there's a possibility of something being different is such a powerful thing. It can be life-changing for the person who is ready to take the initiative with it. But we can't dictate who's ready for what and what stage they're at and whether they see it or not, or whether that's the path for them or not. All we can do is be the best versions of ourselves. When we see something and it's a pattern, we can break it in ourselves, and then we can be an example of having overcome that, and we can have compassion for those who are still in that, you know? Yeah. All right, I want to just take a little pause moment and see if there's anything more that's going to want to come up within me here. I don't know if this is feedback from somebody watching or whatever, but I hear things like, but it's not fair, it's not right. Sure, you can think that it's happened for you to handle and stuff, but like, I don't feel that way. It's it's totally understandable to feel overwhelmed by it. Like, along the way there have certainly been moods and times where I didn't want to hear about a solution, and what that tells you, if you're not into the place where you want to know there's a possibility of something else, it means that you still need more validation for the experience you're having. So you got to give yourself that validation. Like, it sucks. Okay, yeah, validate that you're in a sucky situation. Acknowledge that, you know, Give yourself all the validation that you need for the experiences you're having, from the perspective you're having them. No one else is in your shoes, so no one else even knows how valid it is. And it is valid for you. And once you're filled up on the validation, accept that it's the reality. It's like, okay, yeah, this is what's happening. This is what's happened. This is how I feel. This is my experience of it. So if you find yourself in the presence of someone or watching a video like this and you feel resentful of someone else who's healed, or resentful of somebody else who's being an example of a possibility that you're not ready for, it's only because you have not yet been validated on how you feel in your experience. So if you feel resentful of somebody else who's doing whatever they're doing and feeling better than you, right? And you're not feeling good about that, or you feel resentful or jealous or envious, know that all that means is your own situation needs more validation from you. Sometimes we could get stuck if we were looking for validation outside of ourselves. That would be the same as blaming someone outside of ourselves. If we start looking outside of ourselves, retelling the stories of how we were wronged over and over again, looking for validation outside of ourselves, no matter how many times somebody else agrees with your perspective, it's not going to be the ingredient you need, which is your own validation. You need to accept that it's true and real for you, and understand why you're experiencing that way. So that's within you. And yeah, sometimes it really does help to talk with somebody else and see it from their eyes, or have them reflect it back to you. But ultimately, the reason that is helpful is because it may give you a reflection that you need in order to validate yourself, right? And once you get the hang of validating yourself over and over again, and knowing that your own validation is really all you really need, eventually you won't need the other person's reflection or validation anymore. But if you find you might even be addicted to trying to get your validation from outside of you. So notice that as a pattern, if that is the pattern, and maybe there's a reason why you're doing that. Acknowledge that you're doing it. Validate why. Why do I always feel like I need the other person to validate me? Okay, well, because every single time I decided something in my family home, I was told I was wrong. So now I don't know when to trust myself. Or every time I made a decision about something, and it backfired. So now I don't know if I can trust myself. So now I'm always looking outside myself to see if it's valid. Okay, well, really understandable then that you're doing that, right? It's like, totally validate yourself. I understand why I'm always looking outside myself, because that was my experience. It's like, okay, yeah, accept that this is the reality. Okay, the reality is that I've been looking outside myself for validation because I don't feel like I can trust myself to give it to myself, or that I can trust the decision I make, or that I trust that I'm allowed to validate myself, right? And then it's like, well, how does that feel? How does it feel when you feel invalidated, or like you can't get the validation, or that your validation isn't good enough? How does that feel? That feels disempowering. That feels so scary. That feels like I'm dependent on other people. It feels like I need other people. It feels like I'm not good enough. It feels like I need somebody to take care of me. It feels like I'm needy, Be present with all those feelings. So, and the same thing with blame, right? If you are in a habit of blaming somebody else, maybe there's a pattern there. And maybe you need to look at that, acknowledge it, validate it. Why do I want to blame somebody else for this? Why am I always blaming that person when I get triggered? Okay, why are you blaming that person when you get triggered? Let's see. Because if I were to take responsibility, then I would feel all this feeling, and then I would be alone with it, and I would feel like I would drown in it, and I'm not sure I can handle myself, or not hurt myself or someone else, or lash out. I'm not sure I can handle this feeling. It's like, oh, well, I understand why instead you're finding that placeholder and blaming someone. It really makes sense why you're doing that, because you don't feel prepared to handle that emotion, so you need to put it someplace else. Accept that that's the reality. Okay, you haven't felt ready, so you've been putting it outside of yourself. That's valid. Accept that it's the reality, and then be present with how does it feel when you can't be brave enough to be with that emotion? How does it feel when you don't feel strong enough to be with that emotion and you have to put it outside of yourself? Well, it feels mean. It feels like I'm weak. It feels like I'm a bully. It feels like I'm a victim. It's like, okay, well, be present with those ways of feeling. And then once you can be present with those ways of feeling for as long as needed, things are going to shift and start to look different. And then maybe you can take the step of learning the tools. If you've already identified that you don't think you're safe enough to feel an emotion because you don't think you're going to be able to not hurt yourself or someone else, then you know you need some tools. You know you need tools that will assure that you don't hurt yourself or someone else. Especially when dealing with anger, you always have to be responsible enough to make sure you're equipped, right? Make sure you're in a safe space. Make sure you promise yourself you're not going to hurt yourself or someone else. Make sure you promise yourself you're not going to be destructive, you know? So this is you becoming a conscious and aware of what it is you're dealing with and taking responsibility just by doing those things. So those are all vital, important steps along the process of taking responsibility for self. There may be a habit of not being able to be present with emotions too, which usually distractions. The protection mechanisms that we have in our operating system, so-called ego, right, designed to protect us from having to feel those things or see those things or have those experiences again, that flares up a lot sometimes when we're attempting to be present with something. It's like all of a sudden, I mean, it's very common for me to be working with a client and then we're right there at the step of being present with the emotion because we've identified a loop, we've acknowledged, we've validated, we've accepted it's there. And then it's time to be present with the emotion. And then the client like thinks of a story to tell me. And they're like, they get off topic and they try to distract from being present with that. And that's their ego trying to protect them from having to feel that feeling because the ego or their instincts deemed them incapable of dealing with that feeling. So in that those are the times where I gently point out to them that that may be what is happening and see if they would like to redirect in order to be present with that emotion. And I just gently explain that, okay, there's something here trying to distract you from being present with this emotion. You know, sometimes that awareness is enough to help them refocus and go back to the emotion. Sometimes they just don't feel comfortable doing that step in the presence of someone else. Depending on what it is, that's understandable, right? Sometimes we want to be alone in our bed or in the bathtub or the shower to feel these things and cry them out or whatever. And so if that's what we identify, then that is the next step that that person has to take, you know, within themselves. Or we can see what else is in the way. What is there a hidden benefit of keeping it, of keeping this unprocessed feeling, you know? And then we can go in that direction to untangle things and see what it is holding us back. Yeah. Oh, I was just thinking, oh gosh, was I doing that to myself when I had that sad feeling surfacing? I really do intend on setting some time aside for myself to be in meditation and be present with that sad feeling. So I am intending on processing it through. But I will end this video now so I can go do that because I don't want to forget or neglect this part of me, right? And also I think it's funny that like I continued talking through while that probably that sadness within me was probably like, hey, I thought I got your attention. Didn't I get your attention? And then I was talking about being distracted when you're trying to be present with the feeling. I mean, this is how it is, right? We create our reality. This is our creation. So what story are we telling? I literally lived out the story I was telling you right now. So What do you think? What's your experience? Any questions?